Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 183 of Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is the first week of September 2025. In today's podcast, Moscow keeps escalating attacks on Ukraine, but Kiev will respond using new weapons very soon. And we'll discuss the peacemaking troops in Ukraine if this scenario is realistic. As expected, Moscow has once again increased its air and missile strikes, but Ukraine clearly holds the advantage in this confrontation. Recently, the Ukrainians have targeted two main types of infrastructure: fuel facilities, particularly oil refineries, and railway junctions, including bridges and trains. By deploying strike drones to lay enough anti-tank mines to collapse a bridge, sending kamikaze drones to disable a sizable portion of the enemy's oil refining capacity, and attacking rail hubs with drones and possibly new Flamingo cruise missiles. The Ukrainians are evidently causing significant damage to their opponent. Even if we overlook the high likelihood that Ukraine will introduce its own design for medium and short range ballistic missiles this fall, capable of competing with ATACMS, the ability to produce 30 large cruise missiles per month and over 200 by the end of the fall is already nearing a turning point in the fight for Ukraine. Since the Flamingos are large cruise missiles, many will be shot down, but the use of decoys and strike drones almost guarantees that some missiles will hit their target during a salvo, delivering a devastating blow to any object hundreds of kilometers deep into the Russian territory. Warheads and fuel can still be optimized, so the maximum declared range of 3,000 kilometers or approximately 2,000 miles can indeed be reached, even with maneuvering to deceive air defenses if it's possible to reduce the warhead size without sacrificing striking power. In the coming months, Ukraine will be able to launch significant strikes against the most densely populated regions of Moscow Empire, Kremlin's empire, nearly every few days. The Ukrainians probably already have at least 100 Flamingo rockets stockpiled, assuming production has reached one rocket per day. Since the Donald Trump administration seems to have repeated Biden's mistake by restricting Ukraine's use of both ATACMS and Storm Shadow through limited access to certain data, the effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes on the air is likely to only grow. If by the end of the summer Ukraine can produce at least a dozen medium sized ballistic missiles monthly, the Russians' command post should prepare. It is almost impossible to underestimate how disastrous the consequences could be for Moscow if Ukraine, as now seems quite likely, manages to match or even exceed Russian missile production with European support. A new American missile with a range of over 400 kilometers, launched from Viper F-16 fighters, could also potentially play a significant role if Ukraine actually receives hundreds of such munitions by October of this year. Unless Moscow withdraws its air defense from the front lines and concentrates most of its combat aircraft on defending it against Ukrainian drone and missile attacks, September and October will be tough, and that's just the start. Strategic strikes alone won't decide wars, but their effect on Putin's empire could be much more damaging than his attacks on Ukraine. There is too much territory, too many weak points. There will always be a way to deliver air weapons to crucial targets necessary for Putin to keep this war going indefinitely. The shock felt by ordinary Russian citizens when they see a drone or missile hit their land is reflected in every video they post online. One way or another, Whether on the front line or deep in the rear, there will be gaps in their air defense systems. This will be inevitably weaken Moscow's military strength very soon. Another important point is that Ukraine's extensive deployment of highly accurate weapons capable of striking targets in Moscow makes any hypothetical nuclear escalation a demonstration of complete powerlessness. Would Putin really trade the Kremlin or one of his luxurious homes to destroy one or two Ukrainian cities? What's the point then, except to show his utter inability to win in other ways? Perhaps this is the best news since the war began. Today, nuclear weapons have become synonymous with the apocalypse. Those who don't show blind reverence for them and considers almost heretics worse than Russians if they truly believe in the sanctity of nuclear doctrine. Of course, no one cares that from 1945 to 1998, over 2,000 nuclear devices were detonated on Earth, a significant number right in the atmosphere. Yes, only two were detonated over cities, but only ignorant people seriously believe that in a nuclear war, cities would be the main targets. It's not a 1960s outside. Let's not forget. The moment you start truly wiping city off the map, the logic of nuclear deterrence falls apart. This marks the point where mutual assured destruction kicks in because it quickly becomes clear to everyone the situation is out of the control. This is why nothing, nothing like this will ever happen except by mistake. But even then, if by some absurd coincidence one or two cities vanish from the face of the earth, it will not be the end of the world for the remaining 8 billion or so people. Otherwise, the end of the world would have occurred back in 1945. That's why complete disregard for nuclear weapons is the most appropriate stance when analyzing the war in Ukraine. Furthermore, even if Ukraine were to test a nuclear device tomorrow, it would have little effect on the war's course. Moscow would continue its attacks using conventional weapons, and Ukraine would likely never consider using nuclear arms. In practical terms, Ukrainian strikes deep into Russian fuel infrastructure are very serious. If this continues unrestrained, in the long run, Russian logistics will start to break down on a large scale. Additionally, an unpleasant reality for the Russians is that a train with fuel, which Ukrainian drone operators shut down about a week ago in the occupied Zaporizhia region, is still blocking the railway tracks. The burning fuel might have wrapped the rails, requiring significant repairs. As far as I know, this is the only railroad connecting inland regions of Moscow with the southern front. If the Russians plan something large scale near Zaporizhia, seems like it's not going to happen soon. Meanwhile, Ukraine is pursuing its own plans. So, Moscow and the Russians must be prepared. So let's talk about the coalition of the willing, which keeps discussing the placement of peacemaking troops in Ukraine and if this is a possible scenario. There are realistic formats within which military personnel from European countries can appear on the territory of Ukraine. A year and a half has already passed since French President Emmanuel Macron first spoke about deploying Western military personnel in Ukraine. Initially, this idea was seen as unrealistic in the beginning. However, it was later considered. Details on how it might happen started to emerge. There were several attempts to back away from it and forget about it. Still, the discussion continues today, which is a positive sign. Since the discussions are ongoing, there is a chance that a practical solution could be found someday. If we are realistic, then we need to consider a very clear example This is our own experience from 2014, when the Russia annexed Crimea, to 2022. The model proposed by the so-called Minsk Agreement signed between Ukraine and Russia is quite common in peace process. Heavy weapons are withdrawn, and then the warring parties occupy specific positions. When discussing the exchange of territories, this is a part of the process. It's not so much an exchange as an effort to strengthen the line of contact which the other side will not occupy. Heavy weapons have been withdrawn from both sides, covering a range of about 40 kilometers. Reliable international mechanisms are in place for monitoring this. When we discussed during the period 2014-2022 the possibility of conducting a peacekeeping operation, they always mentioned the front line length of 600 kilometers or approximately 400 miles. This was compared with other missions. For example, one of the few successful missions were in eastern Croatia, specifically in the former Eastern Slavonia, Baranya, and Western Srem. They scaled this to Ukraine and, based on the most conservative estimates, an incredible number of troops would be required. They also considered that peacekeeping in general is currently experiencing its worst period. However, it had its peak during the mid 1990s when there was a small mission in the small area about 70 by 30 kilometers where it was feasible. A key factor in the success of this mission was the NATO air umbrella. At that time, everything aligned perfectly, including leadership. The mission's head was an American who served as Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, establishing a direct connection with the US State Department. This exemplifies the ideal situation a mission can achieve. And returning to the question, can European peacekeepers go there? They can, but given the number Europe can allocate, it would be one soldier every 10 kilometers. But that's not even the main point. The real issue is what happens if Russia violates the agreement. Peacekeepers have a mandate and rules for using weapons, as designed by the founding fathers of the United Nations. Through them, though, since then, all of this has largely remained on paper, and today it doesn't really work. So, this is the reality if we consider it to the fullest extent. If we look at it more realistic ways, that military personnel from European countries could appear on Ukrainian territory, these still align with what was proposed from the start. For example, small contingents could be stationed along the Belarusian border. They could also be air defense forces in regions such as western Ukraine, and Russia would clearly be aware that NATO's air defense are present there. This awareness might make them cautious about the risk that NATO servicemen could be killed. Well, and of course, these are training missions that could also take place in Ukraine. Ukraine has already gained experience through cooperation from 2014 to 2022. There is also another reason. The model that was used until recently is an enhancer of NATO security guarantees is the presence of small contingents in the Baltic countries. These are essentially hostages that deter the aggressor so that the Russians clearly understand that if they go there, there is a chance that an American or German soldier could be killed, and then everything would change. The situation with the appearance of European peacekeepers is unpredictable, but this doesn't seem likely anytime soon. Probably not until Russia is somehow miraculously forced to stop firing. I am asked how much I believe that their aircraft and the air defense systems will enter here alongside the military from European countries, as was discussed the other day in the American media. I will say that it is technically possible. To put it simply, any air defense system involves ground and air assets. Even when large strikes are carried out, there is still a division into sectors. For example, either aviation operates in a specific sector and ground air defense does not, or there is a separation by altitude to prevent so called friendly fire. Therefore, I would see it this way: our partners do not just send planes here, but completely take over a certain region, or possibly several regions. The safest zones are those next to NATO borders, such as Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. There are no European countries in the United Nations mentioned today. Europeans have long since shifted to a system where they provide financial aid, but their soldiers do not participate. This is because the cost of deploying a European soldier who is trained to defend the country as a peacekeeper is very high. They need to be replaced regularly, leading to constant rotations. As a result, Europe has been moving away from actively sending its military personnel on peacekeeping missions since the mid 1990s. In the former Yugoslavia, Europeans historically played a key role by contributing contingents compatible to those of non European countries. The same applies to Russia. What then explains the actions of France, Germany, and Great Britain regarding the war in Ukraine right now? This is a part of their foreign policy and a way they aim to increase their influence on the world stage. After all, they need to back up their growing power with something, not just economic resources. Today, we see that military strength is playing a significant role again. That is, if this process actually begins in Ukraine, I do not rule out that most European countries will likely send at least some symbolic contingent. This contingent might not necessarily be combat troops, it could be a medical team, reconnaissance unit, or logistics support. Therefore, drawing final conclusions today that only the countries in the coalition of the willing will send their forces, while others have already decided not to, seems very premature. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, share with your friends.